to Raising Joyful and Resilient Black Children podcast, where we bridge conversations from parenting to child well-being and social justice, and we provide resources and tools for parents connected to research that matters to us and to our community. I'm your host, Valerie Adams Bass, and my esteemed co-host, Dr. Sharita Butler Barnes, is out today, but of course the show must go on. In today's episode, we're diving into a powerful and captivating middle grade novel that beautifully intertwines history, identity, and the strength of family ties. We're talking about Ken, Rooted in Hope, by the incredible award-winning mother and son duo, Carole Boston Weatherford and Jeffery Weatherford.
Hi, Valerie.
Hi, Carole. Hi,
Thank
Jeffery. Welcome.
Thank you for having us. Yes.
Now, why is it crucial that we're discussing Ken on our show? Raising joyful and resilient Black children is about nurturing a sense of pride, confidence, and cultural understanding in Black children and adolescents. This book, Ken, does precisely that, and I'm truly happy to have our authors here, and the book does it in an extraordinary way. Raising Joyful and Resilient Black Children believes in the power of storytelling to shape young minds and foster a strong sense of self. Ken educates about historical events, instills a sense of pride in one's heritage, and encourages conversations about lineage, identity, and the strength of knowing one's roots. So, as we delve into the world of Ken today, we'll explore how this book can serve as a powerful tool in raising children who are not only aware of their history, but are also joyful, resilient, and deeply connected to their heritage. So important. The brilliant minds behind Ken, Rooted in Hope, Carole Boston Weatherford, and Jeffery Weatherford are joining us for this insightful conversation. Welcome to the show, Carole and Jeffery. Welcome again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. We are so excited to have you, and I'm delighted that our guests, including you, spend their Friday night with us. I'm talking about Ken. This is an incredible book. So, Carole and Jeffery, congratulations on your new middle grade novel, Ken. This story explores themes of family, heritage, and resilience. Can you tell us more about the inspiration behind the book and how your personal experiences influenced the creation of its characters and their journeys?
The book is set on the eastern shore of Maryland in Talbot County, and our family's roots run deep on the eastern shore, both in Talbot County and in Dorchester County. But in Talbot County specifically, our ancestors were enslaved at a plantation called Y House, which was the largest slaveholding plantation or enslavement plantation in Maryland. There were as many as 900 some people enslaved on the many plantations owned by the Lloyd family. Our family among those people, and Frederick Douglass was among the people who was enslaved by that family. So having been in touch with that land, that region, for all of our lives, as children we visited that area, visit our relatives there. We wanted to see how far back we could go and find some stories from that era to connect us not only with the land, but also with the ancestors who brought us to that land.
Awesome. Jeffrey, what about you? Did you have any other thoughts to add to what Carole has shared with us today?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, I'm her son, and I was
Yes.
along, at first drug along to different historical experiences when I was young, but those experiences, they stayed with me. And as I grew into an adult, I grew to appreciate them more and more. And I used those experiences to, help lay the foundation, drawing from my memory, my own emotions. What I felt while I was at these different places, like there was one museum in particular. Was it the Blacks and Wax
Baltimore,
Museum?
right.
Yes, in Baltimore.
My hometown.
Maybe.
Give Baltimore their props
Yes.
now.
All right now. Shout out to Baltimore,
Right.
also Maryland.
Right, shout out. Right, yeah. So I got very upset in the museum, and I had to take a breather because I started to come into an understanding of how adverse the conditions were for my ancestors, and it really hit me hard, as a kid, and still to this day, it's left a lasting impression and a lasting sense of duty, maybe ancestral duty, to tell people about what's happened, and especially now, now that history is trying to be swept under the rug by, people in power and whatnot.
Absolutely. Carole, I'm going to come back to you, but I want to double back to what Jeffrey said, because on this show, we really do try to talk about and illuminate, the resilience and the joy of Black children. So you said you were drug along, right? About what age were you drug along on those journeys? And when was it for you that you decided to, or it clicked and you said, this is relevant, not just for me learning, but to my personal experience? Although you said this was a family history, family journeys, you said, initially I was just drug along. Like, I was just going because I had to go. But then it meant something to you. So about what age? Can you remember about what age when you said, okay, this is important?
I would say I was well into adulthood. I'm not going
Okay.
to say that I had some, mystical epiphany while I was a teen or anything like that. I was
Okay.
definitely going around and doing all the things that teenagers would do. And then it wasn't until I came into a more cultured understanding of the experience and the opportunities that I had presented to me as a youth and all the knowledge, I was exposed to that other people had no idea about. I realized what a privilege that was to experience those historical places and learning all these things. So I was an adult, I can say.
Yeah, but he was exposed to history at a very young age. In addition to being an author and a college
Sure.
professor, I'm first and foremost a mom. I'm probably least famous for being a mom, maybe infamous for being a mom in my kids' eyes. But yeah, we took them to, whenever we traveled, we
Right.
always made sure that we took them to a historic site or to, an African American cultural institution so that they could be exposed and enriched,
Hmm.
because we never assumed or trusted that the school, however good it was going to teach our kids enough African American history or affirm them the way that we might want
Absolutely.
them to be affirmed. And so, to be affirmed, you not only need joy, but you also need justice. You need to have at least have a sense of justice. And so that was what we wanted to instill
Absolutely.
in our children. And, in addition to encouraging them to pursue things like art.
Sure. No, that totally makes sense, Carole. And thank you for interjecting. And I say that because, Jeffrey, you mentioned that, you were reflecting on those experiences. So I think, that's one thing that parents need to hear, Carole, that the kids, you may not be appreciative, our children may not be appreciative at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, on through high school of going to a Blacks and Wax museum or an African American museum or a legacy museum at that moment. And they may in conversation say, I don't remember, or why does it matter, or it doesn't matter to me in this moment. Now that may be a slightly different given the context we're living in now, but then to grow into a young adult or an adult, and then to be able to have those memories to reflect on and to grow and nurture as an individual,
Right.
builds the resilience, as you said, and builds the platform for standing up for
Right.
justice, particularly for Black children and families. So thank you for sharing and being honest and transparent, Jeffrey. We appreciate that
Oh,
here on this show, both our parents and guardians and the children who may be dragged along to listen to our podcast. So, Carole, I do want to
right.
double back to you and talking about Ken, because it's a very unique having, I'm a reader. I tell people, the library was always
Mine
one of my
too.
favorite places. I just spent Monday and Tuesday this week with a room full of librarians, and it was wonderful. So when I think about and started reading Ken, it really is a unique blend of historical narrative and creative expression, both in the visual as well as the literary presentation. So when you think about the multi-voice poems and how you weave them together, along with the images and the stories that come from different eras and different generations, that long legacy and lineage, can you just share with our listeners what drew you to the poetic form to convey these narratives, and how did you decide which poetic styles would best capture the essence of this legacy of the ancestors' experience in the way that you presented it in Ken?
Most of the poems are free verse poems. There are a couple in there that are limericks, and I think there's one that's a haiku. So, for the most part, they're all the same form. They're free verse. I'm first and foremost a poet. I'm known probably as a historical writer of biographies and books like Unspeakable, The Tulsa Race Massacre. But even when I approach history, I'm usually approaching it through the poetic form, because I started writing, back to my own childhood. I started writing when I was 6 years old by dictating a poem to
Awesome.
my
Awesome.
mother. And my dad was
Mhm.
a high school printing teacher, and he printed some early poems at a very young age. And so back to this parenting thing, I think that, God placed me with these parents. One, my mother, who could see that I had this gift, and my father, who could affirm that gift. by printing some of my early poems, even before I dreamed or knew that a little Black girl could become an author. I was, I
Awesome.
was already being not prepared for it because my parents never said you're going to be an author or you should be an author.
Sure, but
But I grew
nurtured,
into it. I grew
right?
into it exactly. So yeah, so it was
Nurtured,
just
and that's something
natural.
that we as parents definitely need
Yeah,
to
it was
do. Yes,
natural
I'm
for me to
excited. Get
yeah, it was
excited.
natural for me to turn to poetry to tell this story. Originally, it was to be a story just about my family, but again, I mentioned
Hmm.
to you how many people were enslaved at that plantation. How could
Hmm.
I mean, if I were let's Harriet, I'm going to compare myself in terms of these stories to a Harriet Tubman who went back to the South. And then when she went back to the South, she was just going to get her family. That's the real
That's how
deal.
it started out,
She was just
right?
going to get her
Right.
family.
Hmm.
But as she said, how could I turn away these other people who wanted to be free? So I felt like when I was writing this, I just wanted to really write in the voices of my family. But in the process of doing the research, I found these other people whose spirits also wanted to speak through me. And how could I deny
Hmm.
them voice when their voices were so marginalized when they were alive? So I wanted to recreate as many voices as I could. And by surrounding my own family story with these other voices, you get to see a better picture of what my family's lives were like.
Absolutely. A more holistic
Right,
imagery
right.
through the storytelling. So I do want to go back teacher to teacher and ask if you could tell us the difference between a limerick, a free verse, and a haiku
Okay.
for those who are listening, right?
Well, free verse, if it has any kind of pattern, it's going to be a very irregular one. So it's not a predictable form like a sonnet or even like a limerick. A limerick has, I think, 5 lines. And God, you would have to ask me about the meter because I'm not going to even be able to tell you the whole thing. But it rhymes, and they're like,
Just give us
there's some
a
like little nursery rhymes that are even limericks. So let me turn to a limerick. I'm going to have to read one to you out of here. A limerick does rhyme, and a haiku, on the other hand, is a Japanese form, and it's a syllabic form. In English, it's a syllabic form. So meaning there are 5 syllables in the first line, 7 in the second line, and 5 in the last line. So it's 5, 7, 5.
awesome.
And a limerick, as I said,
Okay.
has 5 lines. And it's real, it's real quick. Usually, and a lot of times the limericks are humorous. But I used
Awesome.
limericks in this book to convey some more serious themes. Like there's one about the Underground Railroad, and there's one about an overseer who's extremely cruel. So yeah,
Sure.
so that's, to kind
So
of soften the blow of the subject matter, I used a form that was more lighthearted itself.
sure. Absolutely. So thinking about the forms, and thank you for our crash course for our listeners, getting them primed up or back to school. I just want to, again, in reading the book and just kind of falling in love with the gentleness around such a difficult topic. And then to start out with just the lyrics, if you will, the words, and then to open to the pictures. I must ask you, Jeffrey, given your transparency around, you know, coming into your own and really valuing your own history as
Mhm.
well as African American and Black history. How did you decide and how did you begin collaborating on the illustrations, given what we've just heard about the different poetic forms and using that to soften the blow of some of this difficult history?
So a lot of research goes into the illustrations, of course, because it has to be historically accurate. I can't draw the enslaved peoples wearing Nike gear and all types of stuff because that didn't exist. And, I wouldn't get work. The publishers wouldn't really go with that. So I
Sure.
do something and I go to the Library of Congress.gov, which is a huge resource of historical photographs, documents, journals, firsthand experience, secondhand experiences, basically a huge reference for American history. And a lot of research is also done by my mom, and she will also send me different snippets of photos and ledgers, like writings from ledgers, and just all different arrays of content for me to pick from. And she will also let me know what she feels like should go into the book. If there's something like a strong point that she feels like needs to come across, she'll let me know. And I'll definitely, honor that, respect that, and put it in the book. Most of the things that she says, she wants in the book are going to go in the book if I'm the illustrator.
Sure. So I have to chuckle and say, okay, what was it like working with your mom? as a professional illustrator and your mother being both a professor and an author, so really doing
Mhm.
your own research both on the stories as well as the imagery. What was it like working with your mom for our listeners who may be about to go into business
Mhm.
with their parents?
Right. So, it's fun. It's fun to work with your mom. For the little ones out here listening, you get to travel and go around and, sign autographs if you're in the realm that we're in, of course, I don't know, different types of businesses have different types of high accolades that you achieve, but that's one of ours. So that's one of the rewards. And of course, the actual work process, we don't typically work together, like in the
Hmm.
same room or the same building or anything
Or
like
even the
that
same city.
outside of her. Yeah, or even the same city, exactly,
Okay.
or the same state, right? And she lets me know, like I said, if she wants something to go into the book that she feels like has to have, like, is a strong point in the book, and I will again put that in there. But a lot of times, I'm not showing her the
Right.
artwork that I'm doing. She might see the initial sketches for things, but then like the end, when I turn in the illustrations to the publisher, that's pretty much the first time that she gets to see them as well, the final
Oh,
illustration.
wow. Okay. So there's an element of collaboration and
Yeah, I
surprise.
don't get a whole lot of
Yeah.
special privileges, although I should. I should.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
But we keep
I
it
I
think
might
that's
show
a
you
hint.
we keep it professional. We work together
I
pretty
think
much the
that's a
same way
hint.
as other authors and illustrators, I think.
Yeah,
That
there's
sounds like a
long
hint,
And if
standing
we lived
Jeffrey.
in the
I
same
think,
household, it might
I
be
might show
different,
you
you
this.
know.
yeah,
Yeah,
that sounds like a
I might
little bit
not
of
be
a
able to
hint.
see. Like,
I'm
yeah, mom,
wondering,
watch, look at this.
exactly.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
wondering if you might want to share some of your artwork. Is there something that we might be able to
Sure.
share with our listeners to the podcast
Absolutely.
from the book?
So this is Chicken Sue. A illustration was a portrait. That's the type of illustration that it is of one of the enslaved. She was an enslaved young girl who tended the animals. And there was an instance of chicken fighting in the book, and she didn't like that, her friends were fighting. So my favorite styles of art, one of my, I guess my form, is doing portraits or portraits. So the portraits that you see in the book, I really aim to have them be as photorealistic as they could be. And one of the difficult aspects of working to do photorealistic artwork in the historical time frame that we are talking about is that a lot of photos aren't very high quality. So one of the most photographed man in America at the time, Frederick Douglass, there are a lot of photos of him.
And one thing Jeffrey hasn't mentioned yet is the fact that these are scratchboard illustrations done digitally.
Scratchboard.
So using a classic form of art using technology.
Right.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So you can see this photo, well, this illustration of Frederick Douglass is very high quality. I would say a high quality rendering. But there's some images in the book that I didn't have that that well of a quality reference. Like this wasn't a photograph. This is Francis Scott Key, and this
Mhm.
was like an actual. I think the reference photo was like a print that was done of him. So it wasn't like real life. And I think personally, it might just be like an artist. Maybe I'm being too hard on myself, but I feel like this isn't as high quality of a rendering as the Frederick Douglass. But I'll leave that to the readers to decide, or maybe it won't be something that they're thinking about at all. And that's just how artists think, right? I'm the hardest critic on
Yes,
myself,
sure.
right?
But I think that, the literal art, the written art form in this particular book, as well as the visual art form, which I think is great for middle grades because we have different levels of readers. And what I think is so fabulous about this book is that you have the visuals that accompany the storytelling. So for those readers who may be disinterested when they first see all the words, although they are in poetic form, once you see the pictures, you have to be a little bit curious about what's the story behind or what's the story that accompanies this picture. So I think that's what makes it
Right.
and incredibly attractive to middle grade readers, those who are high readers as well as those who are low level readers, and it gives them a chance to take a break right? Because this is a pretty intense topic. So awesome. And thinking about how they come together to tell the story and bring the reader along. So thank you for that. Carole, when we were talking about the artwork that Jeffrey put into the images in the book and how they are woven together to tell the stories, like there are a couple chapters where all the family members are listed, the children. Then later on, we hear about some of those children and what responsibilities they had in the big house. So when you think about the characters in Ken, which is really a story at heart of the strength, really the resilience and the strength of family ties across generations. How did you approach crafting those intricate relationships between the characters, those who were blood relatives and those who weren't, to convey that intergenerational connection and also the challenges that they face together? And then, Jeffrey, as we're listening and talking about that, just thinking again about your artistic talents and how did you use those to portray the emotions visually? Because I think the word and the visuals work together. Carole?
First of all, the way I approached this entire project was knowing that family stories are treasures. Also, I realized that probably on the back end of this project, that knowledge of one's lineage is really a form of generational wealth.
Absolutely.
It's a form of you can't take it to the bank, but on the other hand, you can't lose it in the stock market either. Once you've got that, you've got it. But sadly, it's something that most Black people don't have. And if we even attempt to trace our roots, many of us won't be able to go back beyond the 1870 census because we were not considered human beings. We weren't even, we were property, and you won't find us in a census. Our fate when it comes to genealogical outcomes often has to do with the kind of record keeping that the enslaver did. So fortunately, the enslavers of my family, at that part of my family, kept really good records and gave those records to the Maryland Center for History and Culture. The family was the Lloyd family, and in those ledgers, I was able to find, my family going back to 1770, before the Revolutionary War. But I was also able to find names of other people who may or may not have been related to my family. Some of the same names came up again and again. Some people had surnames, some people did not. But nevertheless, at Y House, that was the name of the plantation, which was the flagship of the Lloyd family. They had many farms in that county, but that was the flagship. That was where they lived. There was a community of 300 enslaved people. And in large part, it was a kin community. So these people are having babies and, bringing new generations, but it all started with a few families. And so it's really this huge kin community. And so I realized that family not only meant, my blood relatives, but everybody was family there. Not just by blood, but because because they all shared the same condition and they were bound by water and it was so hard to escape. I approached it that way that, I know that some people were my relatives because they had my surname, but other people may have married in and out of the family, but certainly they were one big family at this plantation, whether they shared blood or not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks. And so thinking about that kin relationship, as you said, both blood and those who weren't blood, but, being in that space and sharing that experience, both the joy that they could capture as well as the hardship. Jeffrey, how did you approach including images that might capture some of that kinship relationship that we might see in some of the images that are included in the book?
So one way that I decided to add a line of continuity through the book is to use my own family as references within the illustrations that we see. This chicken stew, she's not one of our family members, but if you look through the book, there are certain images that are actually, family members. Like my niece is in the book, my wife. I'm in the book in a few of the photos used for different shots, as well as actual family members.
Okay. So really leaning into your actual family's relationship and including that. So bringing them alive, making the connection in the book. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So thinking about that, and as you said, thinking about contemporary as well as those historical images, those past generations of your family, right? This multi-generational relationship that appears in the book. Carole, you mentioned, early on when I, was asking Jeffrey about how he came into his own, interest in this. You talked about the role of parents and being the first educators, right? The home is the first place that we learn that, we can't necessarily leave it up to the schools to educate our children, as well as Jeffrey mentioned. Now, when we think about the distortion and attempts to distort American history even further, there's levels of the Black American identity that come through in this Ken story, right? So even today we have relationships. For example, my daughter has numerous aunts, although I only have two blood sisters, right? So she has numerous aunts who are part of that kin connection and that village. So we think about, how this book addresses themes of identity and heritage and how we tell stories, both your approach to telling stories, to writing this book, as well as the stories that are told about the characters who appear in this book. And what is it and how do you want young readers to connect with and reflect upon these stories, particularly when we have young readers whose parents may not engage in museum visits and books and historical content about the Black experience in America? So this may be for some middle school students, whether Black or not, but particularly Black children, this may be their first engagement with this kind of story about the Black experience that follows multiple generations. So when you think about that, how can young readers, or how do you hope young readers connect with the themes and reflect upon them given the time that we're living in, at the tail or still, moving through this Black Lives Matter movement, thinking about the long-standing and continued impact of COVID-19 on generations and that legacy? What would you like young readers, particularly young Black readers, to take away or gather from this book? Carole?
Well, I do want them to understand that knowledge of your heritage is generational wealth. And I want them to value their past, not just what they learned from this book, but what they may learn from other books or from visiting places or from talking to their elders. I want them to value those narratives and know that even though they may not be that interested in them today, the day will come when they will lean on that knowledge because it fortifies us. If you look at the way, at the stories in the book and the way that people had to lean on each other, we're still leaning on each other. Our community's not the same anymore. It had to evolve, but we still need to be able to lean on each other in the family and in the community. And we still need to look back in order to go forward.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. When I was reading this book in preparation for our conversation, the presentation made me think of the Legacy Museum. I immediately thought of the presentation in the Legacy Museum, which is in, Alabama, and how there are different sort of time periods presented in the museum, the Equal Justice Initiative Museum, where you have stories being told in different formats, to your point. So there might be stories of those who were enslaved, and then there's stories of those who are currently incarcerated, and everything in between. And it's the audio storytelling, the written storytelling, and the visual storytelling. So when I was looking through this book, I said, wow, this so reminds me of the museum. And there is an emotional response to both reading this book as well as walking through that museum. And so I think about that. And I have to ask you, Jeffrey, again, I have to come back because this is such a team effort. How do you anticipate young readers engaging more deeply because of the images that are included in the text?
Well, they say that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, and I definitely agree, when it comes to, judging humans, right? Of course, that's an analogy. But artwork is what attracts kids to, that first initial touch point for the book, and a lot of people we are drawn to things that are visually interesting, whether that's from the color scheme that it has or the lack of color scheme, like a very monotone book. The art is typically the first touch point that we have, even if that's just text based as an adult. So the job that we have as creatives, the art team at Simon and Schuster, as well as myself, we have a very intense job is to get people to pick the book up. right? Getting people to pick the book up is
Sure.
not a huge part of the battle. So I wanted to have someone who is around the age range of the target audience, which happens to be our niece, well, my niece and my mom's granddaughter. So I wanted to make sure that it was speaking to that demographic. People tend to gravitate towards things that they can see themselves in, right? So wanted to make sure that the youth could see
Absolutely.
themselves in the book. There's multiple in this story as well, not just visually, but mentions of them and how they interacted during that time through the poetry and the story.
The book can really be read, one of two ways. It can be read from beginning to end, but because
Mhm.
it's poems, I mean, you could read a poem in the voice of any one character. Each poem can stand alone, and it tells us each poem is itself is its own story. But if you read all of them, you'll see how how many of them connect because the people in the poems are connected.
Sure, sure. I love, love, love the cover. I hear your pun, not intent. I love the cover. I actually love the back because it shows multiple generations, and I think that would pique the curiosity of young people. I have to give truth in advertising that I have worked with the Children's Defense Fund Freedom School, and we are, they're always looking for texts and books. And I think about those readers who are voracious and those readers not so much, right? So there are always books that include poetry because it's easier to engage
Right.
them. And I love, like I said, the different ages, not just the different generations over the time period that are presented on the bag, in addition to this bold front facing cover, but I see different generations here. And I like, Carole, you said you can read, it doesn't have to be a chapter by chapter. You can just open, which is kind of what I started reading chapter by chapter, but I said, let me flip through, and started reading. So I love that about this book. And I'm excited to have other young people read it and get their hands on it and to see it in lots of spaces. So I have a couple of questions. One is there a teacher's guide to go along with it, or will there be a teacher's guide to go along with it? And then two, related or not, depending on who you ask, how do you see this form and this text coming out now when we have so much celebration of hip hop at the 50th year anniversary? And, so many of the originators talking about, the poetic form in verse. How do you see, or do you see this as related in terms of the different selections of poetry that you've chosen to include in the text?
Well, I don't necessarily see this book tying in, not yet, right now per se. My
Mm-hmm.
my mom has been saying, Jeffrey, you should make a rap about Ken. I also rap. I used to want to be a rapper a long time ago, once upon a time, but I use it for
Sure.
edutainment now, for the kids, and I make
Mm-hmm. Sure.
history hop,
Absolutely.
for a lack of a better term. So, my mom wants me to write a rap
Sure.
about Ken, or Ken rap. So that is
Mm-hmm.
kind of the way I could see it tying in to the 50th year anniversary. But as it
Sure.
stands now, as poetry, like as short form poetry, I don't necessarily, me personally, not necessarily saying that it can't happen, but I just don't see anybody picking it up and saying,
Sure.
the hip hop 50th anniversary. I don't think it's that type of.
Sure.
Until you
Like I
write that
said,
rap.
until I
Right.
will.
You can write the rap, or we can just use rap as an
That's
entree,
right.
as a segue into
That,
connecting with the book. So I
It's all
don't necessarily, and
poetry.
reading it, right. I didn't necessarily see it as, wow, this reminds me of the 50th anniversary, but the teacher hat in me, the parent hat in me
Yeah.
said, how would I get a reader who's not a reader to think about this and get excited? And there's so much storytelling, particularly when we hear more recently the interviews of the early, progenitors of rap and the storytelling that they were
Mhm.
doing. So thinking about, helping young people to see the connections between different forms of storytelling and the relevance of keeping our history, right? This multi-generational history, this keepers of the culture, and using poetry to keep that culture. So it's not always going to be in rhyme
mhm.
format,
Right, right.
with a pair of 808s. But that's how I think of it. So not maybe necessarily the direct connection, but how do you help young people to connect and to love it? Because I like books. I feel like this is the kind of book that would help young people love to read, right? They're books that you just read and say, maybe later on I have an epiphany, but I feel like the format, the visuals here is the kind of book that you could use to help young people love to read, and that you could make that connection. You could have a dialogue with them around, what do you like about the storytelling of this particular artist? Well, let's talk about the storytelling that occurs in this book. That's probably the teacher had in
Yeah,
me.
most definitely.
So,
And one thing I hope that young people will be inspired to do is to research a little bit of their own heritage, even if they just go back to their grandparents or maybe great
sure,
grandparents. And then they may not know all the information about that person. This is what we had to do. We had to then create the stories around these people because we had
sure,
names and
sure,
we had dates and we had locations and we may have had some details about the location, but then we embellished that. So we had this family
sure,
tree with the roots and the branches, but we had to put the leaves on it ourselves. And that
sure. The
and I
storytelling.
think anybody can, you have creative license to do that within your own family. And it can be a very rich experience, regardless of how much imagination you have to bring to bear to fill in the gaps in the archive.
Absolutely. And we know that that happens even
Yeah.
today within our community. So I want to thank you both, but I have to ask you again, this is our podcast is raising joyful and resilient Black children. And as parents, both of you and grandmothers and uncle, tell us what tip around joy, right? Because we talked about the resilience that was associated with these characters. We talked about your strategy to softening the content, the adverse content and reality of the experience of our generations of Black Americans who were enslaved Africans. So, what's your joy tip for parents and for guardians who are raising Black children today? What's your takeaway where you say, I know that, things can be tough as a parent or things can be tough as a child or adolescent, but here's my joy tip for other parents. What's your joy tip or guardians who are raising Black children?
Well, I'm going to speak, since I'm an author, I'm going to say my joy tip is read a poem with your child and maybe read it at night. You can be a bedtime poem rather than a bedtime story. Read a poem with your child and maybe read the same one over a week and the two of you memorize it together. But it's quality time. It doesn't take long and it's an intimate experience and it shows that you care. And for kids, knowing that their parents care, I think that's a large part of the joy.
Sure, sure, sure. Expressing your care through that reading, that intimate
Right.
moment. No. Thank you,
You're
Carole.
welcome.
Jeffrey, did you have anything you want to share your joy tip for our parents and guardians listening today?
I'll expound upon what she said. Yeah, reading a poem. I'm
We'll
gonna
take
say
it.
writing a rap. I've never done this. I don't have any kids yet, but writing a rap with your kid. I think that would be something cool. Like a little family rap. And secondly, just allow your kid the opportunity to explore what they enjoy. Don't just try and force them to be whatever this world wants to cookie cut kids out to be these days. Everything is not for everybody,
Sure,
but what's for you will be for you, and you will see that glimpse of what they're drawn to. You know, whatever that spark is, and you just have to nurture it again, nurture it, and be patient. Right? It's like I know I wasn't the easiest kid, but bamboo tree, for instance, it takes a long time for it to break the surface, but then once it breaks the surface, it shoots to the sky. So you just have to be patient until your bamboo tree or your kid shoots up.
sure. So that's coming from Uncle Jeffrey.
Yeah, right.
And so you mentioned you have a niece. So I want to thank you both again, Carole and Jeffrey, for sharing with us this labor of love and tracing your family roots and bringing along other members of that kin relationship for the ride and inviting us as readers, as our young people, as well as the parents and adults who love them and the guardians to come along for the ride and learn more about your family and the experiences that are probably similar to so many of our ancestors, named and unnamed. As you mentioned, Carole, the idea that for many of us, unless there was a detailed ledger or account of the slaves, it may stop at 1870, right? Our search of names and people and places. So we are just so delighted that you join us for our first episode this season. We are excited to see where this book takes our young readers. We're hoping that our parents are just as excited as I am to share the book and to become engaged with your family, right? And this kin relationship. So Thank you again for spending your Friday with us. Probably I'm a nerd at heart. I'm okay with that. I'm going to have a 7-year-old. And she said, Mommy, what's a nerd? I said, it's okay. Your mom's a nerd. It's a good thing to be. It's a good thing to be. So thank you both for sharing time. And really, I like, Jeffrey, what you said about nurturing what it is you see in your children or those children who are in your life, which is what Carole shared with us, your mom, this idea that, her mother and father, nurtured this poetic gift and talent at a very young age, as young as 6. So we can do that with all of our children. We're excited for you sharing your joy tips with our parents and guardians who are listening, and even our teachers who may be figuring out how to connect with our students in class, how to bring this book into the conversation that they're having. So we thank you very, very much for joining us, and I look forward to finishing the book.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you so much for having us.
You are quite welcome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your time and your talent with us.
No problem. My pleasure.
Raising Joyful and Resilient Black Children is part of the Alive Podcast Network. The podcast was created and produced by Jacqueline Douge, edited by Manuel Simon of Vita Productions. Follow, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Go to whatisblack.co. Again, that is whatisblack.co for parenting resources and tools. While you're there, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. You can also follow us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at What Is Black. That is at WHATISBLK.